Life History Presentation. I interviewed a 78-year-old man for this assignment. He's a relative of mine and had a somewhat interesting life, which is why I chose to interview him. He was born in Florence, Kansas, and raised in another small town called Burns, Kansas. He has spent his entire life in Kansas and had plenty of interesting stories to tell me. Throughout this interview of his story showed me how he developed throughout each of Erickson's 8 stages, obtaining all 8 of the basic virtues. Trust versus mistrust. This is the first stage and is from birth to age 1.5. During this stage, the child is uncertain about the world and relies on their providers for consistency and care. The man I interviewed mentioned how he had a normal birth without complications. This shows that he was able to rely on the healthcare providers to help him bring him into this world without any issues. Having a birth without any complications is always beneficial to the development during this stage. He then went on to tell me how he had his mother as his main care provider. She took time off work to watch him and care for him. One of his stories that stood out to me the most was one where his mother helped him save him from choking during breakfast one morning. This shows how his mother was someone he could hope to be there for him in his times of need, such as when he was choking. This stage is based entirely on development of hope and trust within care providers. His mother instilled this hope and trust in him very well during this stage as much as he could remember. Autonomy versus shame. Autonomy versus shame is stage from age 1.5 to 3. During this stage, children are learning to become independent and develop the virtue of will. This virtue helps develop sense of how to live in the world. When I asked him who took care of him, he said his mother still took care of him mostly, but his brother started to take care of him as well. This led to him developing his sense of individualism because of his mom leaving his brother in charge of him. This allowed the both of them to bond more, but also to allow alone time for him, and as his brother watched him, he got to do what he wanted. A story he mentioned was how during this time he had a toy dump truck that he loved to play with by himself all day. This is a sign of individualism, being able to play by yourself and decide what toy you want to use. Initiative versus guilt. Initiative versus guilt is the third stage of Erickson's 8 stages. The age range for this stage is 3 to 5 years old. During this stage, the children are to develop a sense of purpose. This stage is also known to be a difficult stage for parents because the children developing are full of action and behaviors that some parents see as aggressive or bad. It is important to allow the child to express themselves, but also not to allow bad behavior. There should be a balance between initiative and guilt to allow the child to reach success in this stage. 2 stories mentioned by my interview that showed he was able to pass this stage were when he told me him and his brother would fight a lot. This may portray bad behavior, but it shows his assertiveness and initiative to get what he wants out of the argument. The other story during this stage that proved he developed a sense of purpose was taking care of their pet rabbit. He said he remembered always feeding it and playing with it and not letting anyone else do that. This shows that he was able to exercise self-control as well as initiative, take care of the rabbit himself, which gave him a sense of purpose because he knew the rabbit relied on him for food and exercise. Industry versus inferiority. The industry versus inferiority stage occurs during ages 5 to 12 years old. This stage is known as the school stage because this is when most children start to attend schooling of some sort. This stage is where children are to develop competency and knowledge. Children in this stage start to look up to peer groups and look for validation from peers. This helps with their self-esteem and they feel confident in their ability to achieve goals and tasks. Some failure may be necessary to learn and grow from those mistakes. In the end, it leads to helping them problem solve and feel industrious. By encouraging and allowing these children to feel confident, they end up reaching the right level of competence and moving to the next stage. When reaching this stage of his interview, he had a lot to say about schooling. He skipped kindergarten entirely and went straight to the first grade. This to most children can end up being harder traumatic for them. Yet when asked, he said he did just fine and actually loved school and was excited to go back at the end of every day. This to me shows how he was encouraged by others in school, which led to him feeling confident in his schoolwork. By gaining this confidence, you feel inferior and develop the competence to continue through the stages. Identity versus role confusion. The fifth stage is the identity versus role confusion. This stage occurs between the ages of 12 to 18. During this stage, teens go through adolescence, which is when teens tend to search for a sense of self or personal identity. This stage leads to developing the virtue of fidelity, if able to accept others and oneself even though there may be differences among each other. The main way to form this fidelity is by forming their identity based on experiences and explorations. Ways that I saw my interviewee forming his own identity was through sports and academics, at this time as well as accepting himself. He was extremely athletic. He played basketball, football, and ran track. His main issue was his size, though. He was a very short and skinny guy. He knew this, though, and he used it to his advantage during some sports. He said football was his favorite, but he went to college for track after graduating high school. He also married his childhood sweetheart during this time. All of these factors shows ways that he was accepting himself and what his identity was, as well as accepting others, this being his wife. By accepting her into his life as well, this shows he had a sense of who he was, who he liked, and what he wanted to do, proving he did not have any role confusion at the time. Intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation is a stage that occurs between 18 to 40 years of age. This stage is where one develops the basic virtue of love. This form of love does not mean just significant others, but friends, family as well. During this stage, individuals start to act more intimate with others as well as start relationships. By allowing to care for others and trust them, you are able to develop this virtue of love. As stated before, my interviewee had already gotten married before this stage. This was more common back then to get married at younger ages. What proves he had no problem with this virtue was how he already was happily married, but more importantly, taking that commitment at an even younger age than this stage suggests proves he did not question his virtue of love beforehand. He told me he had always been a romantic and loved expressing his love for his wife any way possible. To the right, I have a quote that says, "You always gain love by giving love." Generativity versus stagnation. Generativity versus stagnation is the seventh stage. This stage occurs in the age range 40 to 65, also known as the middle adulthood stage. This stage refers to ways to make your mark on the world by creating and nurturing things that will outlast yourself. By finding a way to contribute to society, you feel more useful and like you have accomplished a way to make your mark. Success during this stage leads to the basic virtue of care being adapted. As mentioned before, this stage is where one tends to find ways to give back to a society. Some examples are raising children, being involved in the community, or being productive at your job. When we discussed his middle adulthood, he had a lot to talk about, but the main things were that he had 4 children during this stage to nurture and have them give back to society. He also was very involved in his community because he ran the county lake. This was a big task, challenging at times, he said, but worth all the hard work to know that he was able to take care of the lake and the individuals at the lake at all times. He was a deputy sheriff, which helped him enforce laws around the lake to keep people safe. By raising 4 kids and basically a community of individuals living at the lake, this shows that he was working to give back to the society and staying involved. This shows he did have the basic virtue of caring. Ego integrity versus despair. This is the final stage known as ego integrity versus despair. This stage begins at age 65 and ends at death. This stage is where most people like to contemplate their life accomplishments and if it was a successful life at that. By allowing yourself to keep an open mind when looking back on life, this leads to a sense of closure and completeness. If you achieve these feelings, this typically leads to you developing the basic virtue of wisdom. To the right, I have a quote that says, "Knowledge comes from learning. Wisdom comes from living." To me, this quote means that without living, you really don't learn as much as you possibly could. Living, you get experiences throughout life that give you knowledge that books usually couldn't. Ego integrity versus despair is during this, I asked him what his biggest accomplishments were in life. He simply stated his family and his health. He was a simple man but had plenty of wisdom to share. He worked jobs of all trades. He raised 4 children. He had money. He had many strong relationships with friends in the community, and above, he said he always tried to keep a positive outlook and to just keep going. I asked him also if he could change anything about the past, and simply laughed. He simply laughed and said that changing things is always something we wish for, but knowing that everything happens for a reason helps ease those thoughts of changing the past. By talking to me about his past so humbly, I could confirm he had developed a basic virtue of wisdom during this stage of life. My conclusions of his life throughout this interview. His development and growth seemed to happen at an average rate without any major issues. He had some hardships in life, just like most people do, but instead of them holding him back in certain stages, he chose to rise above them and work towards his goals and future at all times. Based on my interview with him, I feel as though I can confirm without a doubt that he has achieved all 8 of the basic virtues. His 8 virtues are hope, will, purpose, competency, fidelity, love, care, and wisdom. He still continues to live by his same philosophies that have worked for him throughout his life. One of them being, take care of your body and take care of your mind. Ramifications of this conclusion for the social work role. For future social workers, I would say that going through someone's life history like this assignment can reveal not only a lot about that individual, but a lot about oneself as well. By allowing yourself to provide help to individuals or just listening to their story allows a social worker to use the basic virtues themselves in the day-to-day social work field. Having these basic virtues is important to social workers because we use them daily, most of the time without even knowing it. It also is important because without these basic virtues, we would face ramifications in our line of work because these virtues are crucial to forming a bond, trustworthiness, or instilling hope within potential clients. Throughout this interview, what meant the most to me and stood out the most is that in this interview was how even through the traumatic experiences he faced, such as the suicide cases, drownings, and boating accidents while working at the county lake, he did not let those incidents stop him from doing his job and continuing to show up every day, ready for whatever will be thrown his way. I am also a romantic myself, so hearing about the story of how his 8th grade crush turned into his wife was very heartwarming. Keeping a love alive for that many years and happily, might I add, is something I feel happens less and less often today. So it was nice to hear this love story and how it evolved throughout the years. And here are my references.